dialed is not in service at this time.
This is a man's world.
Greetings, conservatives. This is ConservaCast Episode 6. My name is John Moraga. If you've been with us before, thanks for sticking with us. If this is your first time, welcome aboard. I just want to take a moment to say thank you, a very genuine thank you, for all of you who have been with us since we launched in April of this year, and for those of you who have listened to the previous ConservaCast, and any and everybody who's demonstrated their support and their continued encouragement of Conservatives Corner. We can't do this without you, and we just wanted to send out a very genuine, heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you who have contributed your funds, your time, your outreach, your social media connections. It's definitely been humbling to have as much of and continuous of a following as we've had up to this point. So thank you. Moving along to some of the top stories that we found of interest domestically, the ongoing sexual assault accusations, specifically most recently with Senator Al Franken, who is a sitting senator and has refused to step down amongst some very damning information, especially a photograph of him either mocking, as one newscaster phrased it, or actually assaulting somebody. And what happened after that, according to another accusation, some mounting evidence that has started to come out against Senator Al Franken. However, not to get too wrapped up on one story, I think even a bigger story that we should keep in mind is how much this whole narrative is actually starting to backfire and have a different result than what may be intended by many or most people who would report on this. That is that when there is just a bombardment of information, as I addressed in the previous episode of ConservaCast, it becomes overwhelming. And in this particular case, when there are so many accusations that are made and so many people who are being accused, some of the names start to blur together, some of the times, some of the places, and it's very understandable in human nature to not be able to process as much. And so part of what I think might be important to look at is the responsibility and complacency that people such as Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan have had in their positions in Congress as leaders, especially as leaders of the Republican Party, which holds itself out to be somewhat of a more moral party, or that which would champion, at least historically, conservative ideas, most recently not as much. So it's a little bit more of a focus, if you will, if we take a look at who has actually allowed some of things to occur, or at least look the other way, been complacent. And I'm also reminded, I've mentioned this before, but what happened out at UPenn, the University of Pennsylvania, with the scandal with Jerry Sandusky and some of the cover-up that happened with his involvement with young boys. There is obviously I'm not trying to make a direct comparison to the activities, but I am drawing the similarities to how some of this systemic cover-up exists. And if we are able to address those who would be complacent in this and who are in charge and who are in places of leadership, at the very least, we're able to address and focus our attention and possibly deterring and preventing as many future occurrences as possible. So again, there are others calling for Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan to step down because of such egregious negligence on their part to not do anything prior to this. And this extends to other industries and other fields in our society that probably need some more attention. Moving on briefly to Charles Manson is dead. Charles Manson is not somebody I want to glorify and bring too much attention to the man himself, as much as what he represented and the time era that his very disgusting and controversial actions took place and those who were involved with him. Again, without memorializing him personally, if we take a look back to when his crimes occurred, which was basically 1969, but leading up to that, prior to that, he had a history of crime, but he also essentially indoctrinated a small group of people who carried out, excuse me, the more gross and serious crimes, which was murdering and basically chopping up, or carving up rather, their victims. And one was an actress who was actually pregnant at the time. And it's too gross to get into the details, but the point is just that some people don't forget that. But when we do, we don't put what's happened recently in as much context. We seem to forget the underlying evil that exists, especially those, without trying to politicize this too much, but especially those on the left who would try and call for gun control or restrictions on arms. It's important to remember Charles Manson's associates, who actually carried out his murders for him, didn't have a gun. They didn't actually shoot their victims, at least in my recollection. The main murders, the most famous murders, I think there were a few that they eventually were charged with, but the main, most famous murders that had occurred were done with a knife. Gruesome. Horrible. But the larger picture is to point to the evil that has always existed when these horrible crimes were committed, and still exists. And so it's irresponsible to try and address these evil acts and these evil tendencies and this just horrid crimes by trying to legislate gun control. That's just absurd. And so again, without trying to memorialize that crazy person, I'm just wanting to draw people's attention to what he essentially represented in that time era. And for you to basically kind of maybe do your own recollection and search it on the net and see what you may dig up. It's just something to keep in mind when we evaluate what's going on in our current day and age. And that's enough of Chucky. Moving on to the U.S. is now threatening the Palestinians and basically shutting down their diplomatic offices in D.C. for not essentially trying to move towards peace talks with Israel. And the details of this are a little bit more obscure, and this is apparently more of a political move to basically draw some headlines in raising some eyebrows. Because typically this move would not have happened or even been considered prior to the current administration, but because it does draw as much attention and ire and raise as much eyebrows, it does give some a moment to pause and question, is this a serious move that will happen, or is this just to basically try and move the ball along to other bigger negotiations? But it is, I believe, a little bit newsworthy to consider threatening to close down the Palestinian offices in D.C. Is quite a threat that otherwise might be overlooked. But should it actually be carried out, it would be a serious move. And should it not be carried out, we'll see what kind of results may come as a consequence to it not being. And extending that to some foreign news, North Korea is apparently implementing moves to try and allow its people to access the intranet. That being different than the internet, and that the intranet, for those of you who may not already know, is essentially an internal type of network that is far more controlled and monitored by the providers of that network. There obviously will always be some type of control even with the internet, but the intranet is basically a computer-to-computer connection. And when you have enough ability to connect many computers, it gives a kind of feel of an internet, but is far more restricted and far more monitored, which is pretty consistent with North Korea's politics and government. And so what they're trying to do is allow their people to access these intranet connections in order to give them and provide them their own information and resources. And so should their population try to search for something or find something, they're able to find certain resources on what they're searching for, but it will always be controlled essentially by the North Korean government. There's some good and bad to that, obviously. There's some moves to try and provide some more technology to the North Koreans. But at the same time, because of how controlled it is, it maintains the iron grip of the North Korean regime to prohibit its population from trying to gain free access to information that it doesn't approve. Moving on to the Middle East, in Iraq, technically, Iraq has reclaimed the country, the entire country, from ISIS. And when I say technically, it is just recently happened that they apparently have removed ISIS from some of the small towns and have cleared out whatever remnants there have been. Now, because it is so recent, it's still to be seen whether or not they're able to maintain that hold and prohibit ISIS from retaking what they have just been able to clear. So until that happens, it's still a technicality, at least for the time being. The other technicality is that there is still some dispute on whether or not the Kurdish region of Iraq will still try and gain its own independence. That has been a region that has disputed whether or not it is actually part of the country of Iraq or whether it's its own independent region. And that's different than rebellious or terrorist organizations that just try to uprise. This has been seen for the most part as a legitimate separation or independence movement from Iraq, but there are still some questions on whether or not that will be successful. But it's also a technicality of Iraq's claim that they have cleared out ISIS, because the Kurdish military itself has contributed largely to that reclaiming of Iraq. And so should the Kurdish military and Kurdish forces not agree to provide some of that military support, it could be very easy to see how ISIS could return and regain control of some territory of Iraq. So these technicalities are very sensitive and very tentative upon how long this reclaiming of Iraq is. And moving on, also in another part of the Middle East, in Lebanon, the Prime Minister of Lebanon has recently mysteriously resigned. The circumstances behind it apparently seem to be, as reported, he claims there are some attempts against his life from Iran sources and proxies to threaten his well-being and his life. To further make his resignation mysterious, he did so in a televised announcement as opposed to actually being in Lebanon at the time. He has apparently not been in Lebanon in country for some time and has recently been in Saudi Arabia and apparently, I believe, in France. And until recently, it wasn't known where he was or why he was being as quiet and mysterious. And still today, there is some question as to what has happened. Now, in a previous episode of ConservaCast, we discussed the importance of Hezbollah in the region. So I would refer you to check that out again in ConservaCast episode 3. So if you'd like to hear a little bit more about that part of the world and Lebanon specifically, that'd be a good ConservaCast to check out. Well, that wraps up the NewSkim for this episode. A number of years ago, I was watching this clip of Conan O'Brien. Now, you'll forgive me for venturing into liberal late-night talk show hosts, but he had a guest on, a comedian some of you may know by the name of Norm Macdonald. Now, mind you, this is just a clip. I don't know a lot about Norm Macdonald or Conan O'Brien, or I don't watch a whole lot of them. It just happened to be a clip that I stumbled upon, and for what reason, I'm not sure. So I started listening to this joke or story that Norm Macdonald had told Conan O'Brien. And he appeared to be rambling on. He appeared to be going on and on and on. His joke was taking quite some time. The punchline seemed as though it just kind of was venturing into areas that had no relationship to each other, had no humor to it in and of itself. And so even Conan had made the comment. He waved his hand and started getting restless and turning in his chair. And the comment was made, "Oh, this is some yarn." Now, for those of you listening to this, you'll get why I'm actually taking some time explaining this as part of a reference to what a yarn is, if you know what a yarn is. Now, some of you may be listening and assuming a yarn is that thing that you use to make cloth or sew together, or you do crochet or whatever that's called, and you piece quilts together or something, right? Well, actually, in the context of telling a story, apparently a yarn, I didn't know this until a few years ago, is essentially pretty much a prolonged storytelling that at the end may or may not get you. It may or may not make you laugh or giggle or chuckle or find entertaining. But in the process of explaining this, the actual length of time is part of the humor. The actual painful listening to how dreadfully slow it is to get to the point. It's part of the joke. Because there is something to be said about sitting on a porch out on a lake or a riverbed. There's no other residence for miles and miles. And you're sitting out on your porch on your rocking chair, and you've got a cousin come over and visit. Well, you're not really going to turn on the TV and watch something necessarily. You engage in a conversation. Now, the conversation might not actually be meaningful. It might not actually change the world. But my goodness, it's good company. It's a good conversation. It's interesting to your ear. And so the term yarn is like the actual physical cloth or material of a yarn, in that it can be stretched out very far and keep going and seem as though it's really going nowhere. But when you look at the end product, you might actually have a nice quilt or pillowcase or whatever it is you use yarn to make. And the reason why I'm even telling you all this and taking as long to go about doing this and demonstrate that kind of yarn, which I may or may not be doing so well, is to say we need to laugh. We need to be able to understand that the intake of our everyday life is not to be taken so seriously. Now, I'm not saying to not take life seriously, no. Not saying to drop out of society and be a hermit and not take anything seriously, no. What I'm saying is it's very easy to rile our passions and focus our energy in a negative way if what we process doesn't have a sense of irony, coincidence, imperfection, recognition of the reality of the world. What I mean by that is when we understand inherent imperfection in our existence, when we understand what Christians would call original sin, others may simply refer to as human nature or universal imperfection. If we understand that we don't live in a world that can ever be perfect because every human being's understanding of perfection can never be realized when there are other human beings who have a different understanding of perfection. So without getting too tongue-twisted, the point is, when we understand we live in a flawed world, we can't expect our leaders, our jobs, our station in life, anything to be ideal. And to be honest, I think that's part of what is so great about conservatism, is that it provides that reality check, as opposed to a liberal, socialist, utopian worldview that is just unattainable in this world that we currently live in. So, that being said, we have to laugh at the irony of how ridiculous certain stories can be, certain actions people can take, certain decisions some of our representatives can make, certain things that we see on entertainment or news or whatever information. We have to be able to process things and just find the humor in how ridiculously absurd these things are. The other thing I would encourage people to do is understand what self-deprecating humor is. If you've never heard of that phrase or that term, please look it up, ask somebody. Please understand that we don't have to be so thin-skinned, not to use another phrase or term you may not know, but we don't need to be so sensitive. We can find a way to laugh at ourselves. You know, just the more we're able to recognize our own personal imperfections, our own personal shortcomings, and understand how imperfect we actually are, I think it allows us to fight the next fight, continue on, try to get the next thing done. The more we try to just get upset or be so enraged with either other people who may be able to help us or just those who have been essentially elected and gone back on their word, rather than trying to get as much rage to try and change things, we can try and step back a little bit and understand that, again, the world is imperfect. We can only try to do as much as we can, but when we aren't able to achieve the ultimate goal that we set out to, politically at least, let's recognize how funny that is. Because ultimately, we can disappoint ourselves. Thus, the self-deprecating humor, right? If we understand how much we constantly disappoint ourselves, as in we don't achieve the goal we set out to, we don't hit the mark we wanted to, at least not all the time, then we can understand that, oh my goodness, Apparently, this representative, this organization, this entity was not successful in carrying out 100% of the time, 100% of the things it set out to do, or he or she set out to do. We can afford a little bit of leeway, not to necessarily just forget about it. No, on the contrary, take note. Okay, this candidate or representative did this, said this party or organization did this and said this, and not necessarily be upset or enraged, but take note of it and move on. Perhaps we take a different strategy. Perhaps we take a different approach. Whatever the case, we should find some humor in that disappointment because of how ironically flawed every human being is, and even more so, politics have always been. So let us laugh rather than cry, shall we? I'm not a comedian. Conservatives Corner does not have comedy sketch writers on staff. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe sometime we might try and look into that. But for the time being, we don't actually have official sources of comedy, but we do hope we can try and provide some entertaining material for you to consider from a conservative approach, at least, to at least provide some kind of relief from how stressful politics can be, how disappointing, how overwhelmingly frustrating it can be when certain politicians don't do what they said they would do, when certain organizations don't follow through with putting the money and effort towards what was intended for them to do. It can be infuriating. And when you've been in politics or been around it or followed it even as long as I and so many others have, you do start to see these patterns and get a little bit cynical and desensitized, but still understand there is some way to work within that system. But in order to do that, it's important to be positive and know how to move on and press on once there's been a disappointment. Part of doing that is knowing how to laugh it off. One of the most important principles of conservatism is personal accountability. Personal accountability is something that I have personally seen diminishing over several years, as many others have, no doubt. And for those of you who don't know about my past personally or haven't had the opportunity to listen to some of the other ConservaCasts, I went into the Air Force at 17. And this was back in 1997, to give you my exact age. And I believe I was part of this, if you will, transition generation. And what I mean by that is, as I went in, I saw some of the people who were about to get out and leave, either by choice or they were getting processed out, not by choice. But either way, they had already served some time, and they had understood a certain culture of the military that was reflected from society as a whole. And by the time I had finished my enlistment and was about to get honorably discharged and move on, I had seen some of the people who had just come in from basic or tech school, so to speak. And they had come onto the base, and it was just, during my whole time, I saw this process between those who had left when I went in and those who were coming in as I was getting out. It was just a very clear change of guard, excuse the pun. Now, the Air Force has always had a reputation of being pretty accommodating. But beyond normative or reasonable accommodations of living quarters and food and meals and such, there was just a cultural communication change There was just a sense of I'm trying to think of correct, accurate words to describe how much of a shift there was and what was expected from the higher ups to those who were under them, their subordinates, whether they were officers or enlisted. Without listing a whole laundry list of examples, it was just an overall understanding and feel whenever we communicated with each other or interacted. And because this was from 97 to '01, I can only imagine how different things have become now. And so if that's the military's approach even then, and that's not to diminish the military necessarily, it's just to say that there has been a shift culturally in personal accountability. Now, for better or for worse, the military actually did deal with some of these people in a very disciplinary way as this shift started to occur. So they may still deal with them in that way. Unfortunately, because that has seeped out into the larger civilian population even more so, that self-law, that self-reflection, the rules to which we conduct our own personal lives have essentially diminished to the point of non-existence. So, why is this important? Why does this matter? Well, as I said on the offset of this, I think this is a pretty important principle of conservatism, because if we as individuals aren't able to speak from a point of honor, a point of respect, a point of reflection, a point of humbleness, a point of humility, if we aren't able to reflect and apply conservatism in our own lives, it's impossible to promote conservatism in society at large. Understanding every human being has some level of hypocrisy, it still is fundamentally contradictory to conservatism when we are unwilling or incapable or just ignorant of the process of looking at our own lives and assessing what is conservative about my life, what is not conservative about my life, and how might I change those things. We cannot change unless I am willing. Let me say that again. We cannot change unless I am willing. One more time very quickly. We cannot change unless I am willing. We have to look at me, I, first, before we can hope to cause change in society at large. And I don't want to get too deep philosophically and psychologically with the self. All I'm saying is personal accountability is recognized as a very important principle in conservatism for a reason. With that comes some level of authority from which to speak, from which to process information, from which to analyze, from which to address things. You see, folks, conservatism isn't necessarily something that requires a college degree or some academic achievement, but it does require people to be thinking people. If we have a larger discussion about personal accountability, If we try to incorporate that in some larger context, in some bigger conversation, in some more consistent narrative, that might be a good way to approach the larger picture, the bigger social contract. But we must first look at ourselves and apply conservatism, and as much as we can. That also requires an understanding of what conservatism is. Hopefully, we here at Conservatives Corner can provide at least some guidance, some basic preliminary guidance to which you can find out more about conservatism and how it might be applied in your life. I'm on a quest to revive the word Shant. Shant. Anybody know what the word shant means? Does anybody know what the word shant means? Shant. Shant. Maybe I shan't revive the word shant if I can't pronounce it. As I said, I'm not a comedian, nor do we employ comedy sketch writers, and it may be a good idea to do so. Well, folks, we want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. May you have a wonderful time with friends and family, and enjoy your turkey, your gobble gobble, and have a lovely time talking about anything but politics. Please laugh. Please be responsible. Obviously, I don't condone any irresponsible activities, but I do encourage each and every one of you to take some time off. Thank the good Lord for the blessings you have. Hey folks, I know this was a bit of a shorter one, but as I said on previous ConservaCast, we are trying to find out what works most efficiently, what is best suited for those who will continue to listen in. We welcome your feedback. If you would care to send us a message at conservativescorner.com. We want to continue to provide you these ConservaCasts and various other resources that we provided up to this point. We have an upcoming movie due out very shortly, and we have other resources that we are in the process of presenting to you. However, in order to continue providing you these resources, we need your support. Please consider investing a contribution at conservativescorner.com. conservativescorner.com. Your efforts will help us champion conservatism for generations to come.
Not a woman or a girl